I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Alex Steffen. Alex has been noted as one of the world's leading voices on sustainability and the future of the planet. We're pleased that he could join us today because, you know, we're all out there doing our thing, working feverishly on our pieces of the puzzle, and it's nice to take this opportunity to step back and gain some insight into what kinds of outcomes our individual and collaborative contributions can deliver. We're working on something really big here. What we're doing with smart cities is transformational, and it is undoubtedly going to reshape civilization. So think about that and join me in welcoming Alex Steffen.
So I'm going to be giving this talk from up here. It's so we have a little bit more of a live, immediate feel to it, and also because this cord can't reach all the way over there. So if I'm standing in a different place, that's why. My name is Alex Steffen. I'm a futurist, and I'm a planetary futurist. So what I think about mostly is the ways in which human systems and natural systems interact and are changing one another. And California is a really great place to be doing that, because we're headed into, as a species, into a future that is both terrifying and thrilling at the same time. And California is in many ways at the epicenter of a lot of these changes. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So, as a planetary futurist, I think a lot about images like this. So you can see this is a NOAA image of Hurricane Ophelia, and it's tracking the progression of what was then a tropical storm northwards past Ireland and England. And you see that it cuts off there, right? The map just sort of, the projection ends, right? That's because the modeling software they built didn't include a provision for tropical storms going north of 60 degrees north, right? They didn't include it because it was unforeseen, right? It was unforeseen because it was unimagined. And it was unimagined because to the people who built this software, it was unimaginable. We live right now in the unimaginable. We're surrounded by it all over the place. We often don't see these things, right? They're difficult for us to even notice because we live in a time where there's a real sort of failure of the imagination. A failure of the imagination that's actively encouraged by some, right? Because there are many interests who are going to have to see their businesses change, their industries change, and are fighting to delay that as long as possible to be profitable. And of course, we know that some of those figures are political, you know, what some people call the carbon lobby. But really, a lot of the inertia is also just up here, right? None of us was born into the world we live in now, right? We're all having to learn what is going on around us. One of the things that we're having to learn is that the risks involved with climate change and the larger planetary crisis of which it is part, ecosystems, oceans, etc., are massive. They're almost beyond calculation, and they're happening now. Right? So just this last year, we saw Harvey, Irma, Maria. We know that these are profound impacts to our society, and even close to home, right? We've seen fires and floods and problems, and we're going to see more of these, right? Because we have changed the planet, right? There is no such thing as a new normal. We have shifted the boundaries of these massive systems. And the ways in which those shifts play out are going to be unpredictable and large for as long as, as we're all alive. And we can't just adapt to this. If there was a new normal, if we could say, well, things were like this, but they're going to be like this, then we could just adapt, right? We could change how we do things, we could evolve. But the problem is we don't have a new normal, right? We have to be prepared for a wide variety of dramatic situations, which means we have to ruggedize, right? Ruggedize is a word that comes from the military. How many of you are familiar with that term? Okay, that's great. So ruggedization basically means to create a system that can survive a shock and keep operating, right? So a ruggedized laptop is one that can take a bullet and still check Facebook, right? So we have to ruggedize human systems around the world to be able to withstand a wider range of possible outcomes. And one of the problems with this is that ruggedization is not cheap, right? And the wider the range of outcomes that you need to face, the more expensive it gets. that means that there are places already where we're going to see abandonment, right? Places that are brittle, places that can't survive shocks. And we're going to see abandonment not because people don't want to live there necessarily anymore, but often because financially we will be unable to maintain these places, right? That the value of protecting these places is less than the cost of protecting them. And as we see change in insurability, in finance and creditworthiness and political power, we're going to see more and more places dropping into the zone of what is sort of bloodlessly referred to as residual damage, right? Places that won't get fixed. And here's the best way that I know of to understand the risk that we face and why that risk is changing every other dynamic. The hotter it gets, the more places become brittle. With sufficient heat, the entirety of human civilization becomes brittle, becomes too expensive to protect, right? And we know that the hotter it gets, the greater the chance of extreme outcomes, right? So of runaway climate change, at 450 parts per million, which we're coming up on, we have a 0.3% chance of runaway climate change greater than 6 degrees happening because of the climate change we've already triggered. But at 700 parts per million, which is well within, things we could do, we end up with an 11% chance. That's a 1 in 10 chance of having temperatures that we haven't seen since mammals were around, right? It's really serious, and the costs of that are almost unimaginable. As the climate scientist Kevin Anderson says, we should avoid those kind of temperatures at all costs because the impacts are literally greater than the value of civilization, right? So literally at all costs, we should avoid that. And what we need to do to avoid those costs is becoming more and more difficult, right? That with every passing year, it becomes a more and more steep problem, right? The cuts we need to make in order to get into safe ranges, the emissions cuts we need to make grows steeper, right? So right now, this is our pathway, right? So this was in Nature last year. This is the sort of consensus of at least the climate scientists I respect most, about what a pathway to 2 degrees would look like. Right? So you can see it's halving emissions every decade, starting in 2020, and several other things, cutting land use impacts and trying to figure out how to ramp up sequestration. Right? So cutting our emissions in half every decade as a species is not a small order. And it's made even less small by the fact that climate is a cities challenge, right? The economy, the global economy happens in cities, and cities are booming. Already, more than half of us live in cities around the planet. But by 2050, 70% of us will live in cities, and 95% of us will live within 1 day's travel of a major city, meaning 95% of humanity will live with urban expectations. And people move to cities for very simple reasons, which is that life is better often. And so we have these situations where cities are booming. There's this huge demographic surge, which also means a surge in rising incomes, right? We are looking to have another 1 billion people join sort of global wealthy middle-class standards, and 3 to 5 billion people, depending on your expectations, join the global middle class, right? People who have disposable income, who start buying consumer goods, who look for more opportunities in education and healthcare and transportation. And that requires a building boom that's really hard to imagine. So UN Habitat says to catch up to the global housing shortage, we need to build 100,000 homes every day until 2030. To put that in perspective, that's like building 2/3 of the homes in Oakland every day for 14 years. Well, 12 years now. And that's a lot, right? It's hard to imagine that. It's hard to imagine what a massive scale of demand that is. And of course, it's not just homes, right? There's also infrastructure that needs to be provided, right? People need access to, of course, food, water, but also transportation, energy, waste removal, right? All the services from education to healthcare. There's a massive amount of building that needs to be done to support that. And most of that building has not yet happened, right? So we're going to build at least as much city between now and 2050 as exists in the world, at least as much. That's a very conservative estimate. But the majority of the infrastructure that exists in 2050 has not yet been built. And the difference between those buildings, right, those structures, those communities, and that infrastructure being built in a low to no carbon manner or being built in a high carbon manner is the single most important question for the future of humanity, right? Because we don't just need to take all of the systems that we currently live in now, those of us who are prosperous and live in cities, and make them zero carbon. We have to provide zero carbon at a scale of billions of people. And when we look at what halving means in that context, right, it means that we need to not only provide things that are themselves sustainable, but that are disruptively sustainable, that manage to make things around them sustainable. And we're going to see huge impacts in the economy because of this. Because this scale of demand is the single biggest economic fact on the planet. And the scale of risk that doing it wrong presents, right, is going to be the single largest driver of political change. Part of what that means is that we're going to see more and more pressure to come up with the lowest carbon alternatives. And we're already seeing this in investment circles, right? People are starting to, well, for example, many people are divesting from fossil fuels, including some folks who've made their money on fossil fuels, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. But beyond that, people are starting to think about what carbon pricing can tell them about the best bets in the future, right? If you start to think, hey, it might cost $200 a ton to burn carbon in the future, whether that's a direct price or indirect impacts, then you start to look at things quite differently. One of the things that you do is you start to see opportunities where currently it looks like just do-gooderism. Another thing is you start to see the scale of the risk to business as usual. Who here is familiar with the carbon bubble? Anyone? Okay, so the carbon bubble describes the reality that if we are going to keep climate change at a even mildly disastrous level, we're going to have to leave most fossil fuel assets unburned, right? The differential between the known fossil fuel reserves and the amount that we can afford to burn, our carbon budget, is vast. And if we can't, in fact, burn most of those reserves, they are worthless, essentially, right? Which means that companies that produce fossil fuel energy may be extremely overvalued. So you have people like the governor of the Bank of England, the Financial Stabilization Board, and others warning that we need to be thinking of this as a crash rather like the subprime crash, right? That there could be a sudden adjustment in markets and a lot more pressure suddenly to build clean energy. And there's a lot of room for that, a lot of room. Right now, if we're being honest, the kind of clean energy most of us are discussing is a very tiny portion of all the energy used on the planet, right? So you can see that a switch to transform all of that energy to clean energy in a very short period of time is challenging. But if we're looking historically at what has been done in the past, we might conclude that it was a pretty difficult lift. But history is a really terrible guide for what's about to happen. Largely, that's because of these kinds of curves, right? These are the most underreported stories on the planet, in my opinion, right? Which is that we're seeing the cost of everything from solar energy to wind energy to battery storage, to LED light bulbs drop incredibly fast, right? We're on these learning curves where every doubling of supply involves a leap in technology and deployment skill, right? And there's no reason to believe that that's slowing down. In fact, quite the opposite, that there's some reasons to believe that the steepest drops in price are still to come. So you poll energy experts, and a lot of people are now saying that they believe that, over the next roughly 10 years, we're going to see fossil fuels be outcompeted on price by clean energy for new deployments. And other people are noting that if these curves continue, we're going to see clean energy that's simply cheaper to build and operate than it is to continue operating existing fossil fuel infrastructure. Right? That's a really powerful disruption. And it's a disruption that goes very deep, including into realms that we've thought were like bridge technologies like natural gas, right? It includes storage. Battery prices are dropping really fast. That makes possible things like EVs. And I'm skipping over this because I know a lot of people in this room are already familiar with these trends. But I wanted to point out that these trends are best thought of not as particular interventions in a larger stable system, right? So we're used to thinking of energy use in America, say, as a more or less stable system. We do things a certain way. We may change the car, but we're all going to still drive. We may change, over to wind energy, but we're all going to use energy more or less the same ways. And I think that is absolutely wrong. I think it is already wrong now that we are in for far more disruptive change that is rapid and non-incremental because of accelerating loops between these things. So this is an RMI graph, and they've done some really amazing work showing some of the feedback loops here, right? These are disruptive shifts in systems. And what we're finding out is that those shifts in systems are in fact magnified by urbanization. To put it another way, rapid, dense urbanization is a platform for disruptive sustainability. To put it a different way, a giant global building boom is what successful climate action looks like. Right? That quite the opposite from being our death knell, the urbanization that we're seeing around us and the transformation in existing cities that we're beginning to see is our best hope. Because it's in that transformation that we can deploy really bold system shifts. And some of those system shifts have to do with the nature of the built environment, right? There are things like the passive house standard. Who here is familiar with that? Wow, okay, great. So you all know that it's the gold standard for green building. Well, anytime that you have demand reduction at that scale, you get cascading benefits, right? The ability to cut out an end use of something means a whole cascading chain of impacts that you've avoided. And density is the ultimate demand reduction strategy. So here we have two cities, Atlanta and Barcelona. You can see that they're basically the same population, but people in Barcelona use less than 10% of the transportation energy that people in Atlanta do. Why? Well, it comes down basically to density. That having things you want nearby, one of the best proven findings in urban planning will tell us, drops the amount of energy you use getting them, right? That having access by proximity is by far the most sustainable method of getting what you need, right? The most sustainable trip any of us will ever make is the trip we don't have to make in the first place. On top of that, when you have density, you facilitate all sorts of other changes in our lives, right? So transit, obviously. We've all heard the term transit supportive density, I assume, right? That if you get enough people around a light rail station, it works better as a train, right? But beyond that, it facilitates the ability to build in better walkability, better bikeability. It changes our available options, right? And those, of course, have other benefits, right? Reducing the number of cars improves air pollution, which is a killer of millions around the world. But also, walking and biking themselves have benefits. There's a researcher in Seattle named Alan Durning who was asked once, he's a think tank guy, and he was asked, how can, you're really busy, you run this think tank, how can you afford to spend the time walking and biking to work? And so, he's an analytic guy, he kind of sat down and ran the numbers, and he realized that, that when you walk, the longevity gain is actually greater than the amount of time you spend walking, right? Or as he put it, time you spent walking is utterly free because it's time you would have spent dead. And the right-of-ways that Mayor Liccardo was mentioning, are powerful tools for transformation. If we begin to see them not primarily as the means of moving cars, but as a means of tying together our city in a different way, we can do remarkable things. I'm not going to say much about AVs because there are folks in this room who know a lot more than me, but I will say this, that around the world, one of the things that we're seeing is that the future of cars is slow, right? That it's shared spaces, it's looking at pedestrianization, it's looking at moving things together. Right? Slowness is inherently safer, right? A car traveling 20 miles an hour is not very likely to kill you. A car traveling at 40 miles an hour is bad news, and a car traveling at 60 miles an hour is game over, right? So if you have cars, if you slow the cars down in your city, people die less often, right? It also makes the spaces more usable. And that combination of density and usable public space can turn homes into platforms. Right? It can empower people to make better choices. Because when you're adding technology plus access by proximity, right, plus the availability of things like on-demand services, and public space and shared goods, you get a way of providing high-quality prosperity with way less material impact. Now, the problem, of course, that we're always sort of running up against when we talk about these things is, yeah, but how fast can we build? Here in the Bay Area, it takes us, 10 years to build a building, more or less. We haven't built a lot. I live in Berkeley, where I'm not sure anything has been built since I was a child. And so we have a natural skepticism towards the ability to change things at large scales. And if I can leave you with one idea today, the idea that I would love to leave you with is this, that the built environment and the ways that we construct our habitats and our spaces is changing as fast as every other aspect of clean technology. That we are gaining the capacity to design fantastic neighborhoods with great buildings and terrific public space very quickly. We're gaining the capacity to build buildings incredibly quickly, right? So this is Broad Sustainable Building in China. Have any of you heard of this company? So this is J57. They built a 57-story mixed-use project in 20 days. Now, whether or not this is the solution, I don't know. But we already have such a huge variety of ways of building better buildings faster, right? That you don't need a particular solution to be the silver bullet, right? You need a wave of innovation, and we're getting it. And in fact, we're getting that innovation in ways that allow us to do things that are very green, like Passive House at no extra cost, right? And we're being able to do this stuff, to design it now at levels that are really trivial, right? 15 years ago, this stuff was barely heard of. 5 years ago, it was hard to do. Now you have like Dutch design students doing this in class, right? And coming up with like, oh, we could make a sustainable district, right? So we have a wave of urban innovations whose defining characteristic is not just being sustainable, but is being fast, right? And that makes them disruptive. That means that when you can put in large amounts of density and green infrastructure, in both meanings, into cities in a fast way, it changes the existing fabric. You don't need to bulldoze the city and build a bold new city of the future, right? You need lots of hot spots of innovation. Well, California is actually really well set to do that. We are capable of putting a vast amount of building into places that are already served by transit. Now, some of you may know there was an ill-fated bill to change local planning ordinances around the state to allow just this in the last Senate session here. That didn't go through, but this idea is absolutely sound, right? The idea that we look at where the infrastructure exists now and we prioritize building there. There's plenty of land. There's plenty of room for development. Even in the densest cities, there are parking lots and underused sites. There's the potential to build very rapidly, at scale, at zero carbon, that's held back only by our political vision. And political vision changes fast. We are about to come to the point where denial of reality no longer flies. We know this in opinion polls. We know this in politics. We know this in things like the Paris Agreement, which despite the current administration's hostility to it, is in fact still in force and moving forward. We know this in terms of investments in new technologies and new approaches. We know this in terms of design innovation, right? We know this in terms of activism, right? We know this across the board that we are coming to a tipping point. People who want to be leaders in a zero carbon future need to be ready for that snap forward. Because once the political will tips over, the speed with which things can change is going to be outside of our realm of imagination, right? What can happen in just the next few years is like that very first image I showed, right? It's currently unimaginable, right? We aren't used to thinking of tropical storms north of 60 degrees north. We aren't used to thinking of zero carbon cities being built fast. We aren't used to thinking of saving the world. But I think that's what we're about to do. I've shared some other ideas in this book, and you might find it interesting. You can reach me on Twitter at AlexSteffen. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. Thank you.
Field two questions? Any questions?
No, do we have any questions?
I'm sure that was all totally clear, right? Yes, please. I am generally in favor of using air rights to build. The question was, how do we use air rights, the current development rights over, for example, infrastructure or other buildings to provide more density? And I'm in favor of doing it. There's obviously challenges that have to do with code and regulations in a lot of places, but also in European cities, we're seeing a lot of retrofit innovation where people are literally dropping more units on top of existing buildings. And there's clearly an opportunity for doing that. In general, I think roofs and sort of the open space above us is a really underutilized resource, whether we're talking energy or living space. Oh, yeah, please. I'm sure there is that possibility to build down rather than up. I'm not personally very familiar with what that would take, and I know that people I know in the construction industry say going down costs a lot of money, which is why they try not to do it. But in terms of the heat island effect, or increasingly hot cities, which here in California is going to be an issue, right? Within the lifetime, certainly the working lifetimes of the younger people in this room, we're going to have killer heat waves here. And so figuring out how to cool our cities down is a really important question, and that there's lots of factors in that have to do with reducing pavement, figuring out how to use building siting and shadowing, and so on. The question of whether we burrow for coolth is a really interesting one. I just don't honestly know the answer.
Yeah, Gil Friend, City of Palo Alto. Alex, thank you. I think building down, whether we can build down depends on seismic circumstances and is going to be different in different places. I love your presentation, and one of the things that jumps out for me is the relationship between housing strategy and transportation strategy. People talk about the housing transportation nexus. Our bureaucratic organizations, as Mayor Liccardo referred to, have a really hard time bridging silos and even talking about those issues together. Meanwhile, California's adding population at 10 times the rate of housing. So what do you see as ways to break that bureaucratic siloization and enable us to talk about integrated issues in an integrated way?
Well, so I think that's the 3 million housing unit question, right? There's So, I mean, there's the ideal answer, which would be to re-envision how we work as municipalities and counties and as the state, and to try and do planning that's more holistic, that brings into, urban planning, not only questions of housing and housing creation, right? So not just permitting housing, but actually encouraging it, but also issues of transportation, the facilitation of new infrastructure that has a holistic vision for creating sustainable cities. That would be the optimal way of doing it. Having been involved with cities, I know that changing things at departmental scales, shuffling departments and stuff, is not an easy thing to do. And so I suspect that we're going to have a lot of unofficial innovation going on. In fact, that's what I hear happening now, is that it may not be easy to completely redefine departmental priorities and responsibilities, but you can get people talking and you can get incentives for that. I also think, though, and this is something I would encourage all of you to consider, we lack the kind of great civic organizations that built this state, right? If you go back 100 years, people came together in different ways than we do now, right? For sustained action to produce positive outcomes. That kind of civic organization has almost disappeared. And it's not that we don't have great NGOs, it's not that we don't have great local government people, it's not that we don't have smart citizens, but there needs to be a separate sphere where people really tackle the challenges and opportunities of the state and of our cities in a way that's independent from the agendas and priorities of individual institutions. Getting involved with organizations that are trying to do that is an incredibly powerful means of changing things. And where those institutions don't currently exist, trying to figure out how to recreate them quickly, at least informally, to produce citizen version of plans, to produce citizen input on the need for rapid change, is a really big, high impact action that needn't take all your time. Getting involved can really make a big difference at this moment. So I know that was the last question. You did raise your hand, sir, though? Did you? I'm all for them whenever we can build them. Yeah, I take your drift. I know that we need to wrap up here, so I want to jump in there. You're asking how can a city that was built for the car be made into a city that's built for people, right? And yeah, that's not actually how the world works, though. All of the data that we have shows that as you bring people together, their energy use drops. And there are multiple ways of making sure that as we bring people together, quality of life improves, right? Most of us take trips to places that are very high density, right? If we're not going to go to the mountains, most of us are going to places like, Paris and London, Rome and Barcelona, because those places are really terrific environments. I don't think there's actually any trade-off, if it's done right, if it's done intelligently, between density and livability, my opinion. I could stay and talk all day, but we have things to do. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you.